Well, let's jump into MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. And as one would think, any type of framework to support individuals, particularly struggling learners, would have components. And if you look at these, they seem self-explanatory. Everyone's going to learn, academic, social, we're going to grow, learn, and of course, everyone's going to be responsible. What? What's that? Every leader at all levels is responsible for every student? Yes. And that's a key component in the differences in terms of MTSS. That's something we'll come back to here in just a moment. Now, of course, it's something that we believe in across all educational experiences, but it's different here. Now, let's get started in a little reflection back to what we spoke about in previous modules, and that is, with IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are 6 primary components. And with these primary components, the law has evolved, the law has changed, the law has, of course, had reauthorizations, but it's also been interpreted. And over time, things have needed to be interpreted, things have needed to be altered about what we've learned. And so, in a way, I would argue it's evolved and improved. Now, in one area this has happened is in the area of diagnosis and identification of individuals with disabilities. And so, another area is the idea that we're trying to take past practices and things that, we knew about, we thought were effective, they built on foundational elements, we had advances. The advances made, some of the previous things a little bit clearer, but also potentially said, well, some of those previous things weren't as effective. And then, of course, we want to enact them with current practices that we have evidence behind and we know are very effective. Now, all that is centered around the individual. And the individual, of course, is the center of the school. And, of course, educators, data, interventions, everything we do in terms of scheduling and all that should revolve around the individual. Now, Sean, what does this have to do with MTSS? What does this have to do with tiered support? What does this have to do with frameworks? Well, this evolution in terms of IDEA and this changing of practices that we know are appropriate and more effective led to, right after 2004, this change in what's called response to intervention, or RTI. Now, RTI was Congress's and the field's way of trying to address what was happening in the area, particularly of learning disabilities, but other areas as well, but particularly learning disabilities. And the idea here was that we were trying to assist in, of course, designing effective instruction, identifying learning and behavior problems, particularly for individuals with learning disabilities, and improve overall what we're going to offer. And they did it across 3 tiers, and we're going to slide on to this next slide here. And RTI was really organized around 3 components, and then, of course, the 3 tiers. The first element was we were going to do a prediction and prevention model. And that was different from what we'd done in the past. In the past, we'd almost had a let it fail model, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Now, after the prediction and prevention, we're going to remediate. And we're not going to wait to identify to remediate, and I'll get to the tiers here in just a moment because that's exactly what it's about. And the third thing is, if based on remediation, if it's not working based on our data, we're going to have an assessment to determine if they truly have a learning disability. So let's go over to that model there, and that model is probably familiar to you. So the idea here is Tier 1 is not working. Tier 1 is we're grade level, we're doing universal supports, we're doing practices that are evidence-based, we're really going at it. And we're finding some individuals are just not successful. Now, in the past, prior to an RTI model, these individuals might be lost in the shuffle. These individuals might be uncertain based on the data we're collecting or not collecting. These individuals, we may be saying, you know what, I bet you in a couple of years we're going to identify that individual, but right now they're not eligible for identification because of the testing we use. Well, the RTI model is saying, well, those individuals that might have a learning disability, that might have some challenges, we're not going to wait for fail. We're going to do a Tier 2. In Tier 2, we're going to look at those students, as it says, that lag well behind their peers. And we're going to start doing some screening measures, and we're going to start doing some interventions that are more remediation. And we're trying to prevent here. And then if those individuals are not being successful, and they're really significantly lagging behind, we're going to collect additional data that will lead potentially to identification, but also lead to the more intensive supports and unique special education services they need to be provided. So again, we're looking to the past, and the past had a wait to fail. Now let's take a look at this. See, in the past, what we had these typical individuals within that 68th percentile, and those individuals with learning disabilities would fall between 70 and 85, in terms of ability and achievement. They have this ability, but they're not achieving at that level. Well, to go down 2 standard deviations, and that's where you're almost 2 standard deviations, but 1 standard deviation below, which would be below 85, to actually find that and to assess that and determine that, there was actually a formula in place, folks. And I couldn't tell you what this formula involves. But this formula was what school psychologists could use to determine whether or not there was a difference there between ability and achievement that would be significant enough to determine you had a learning disability. What, Sean? Well, the skinny of it is we are waiting to test the individuals to determine whether or not there's a discrepancy that this formula represents. And if there was a discrepancy, jackpot, you have a learning disability, we can now serve you. Oh, no, you fall not within that discrepancy. Sorry, you don't have a learning disability. Let's go back to the general education classroom. Not too much success there. And actually, this is the model my dad used, a former school psychologist, God rest his soul. But the element here, first of all, to find ourselves here was almost a waiting to fail. You found a large portion of students with learning disabilities being identified when they were probably 3rd to 4th grade. Oh my goodness, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, now early childhood. These individuals had learning disabilities. They just didn't wake up one morning in 3rd grade and say, here I am, I have my LD now. Rather, they really were struggling. They had attention issues, they had learning issues, they had reading issues. And of course, with what we're doing today, let alone what we were doing several years ago, this is going to impact them right as soon as they step foot into the classroom, kindergarten, and 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade. What we're finding with some of these individuals were giving up by then. Definitely you're seeing behavioral issues by then, a lot of frustration, a lot of anxiety starting. Yes, even that early on, because they were recognizing the differences and they were seeing the differences. The teachers were seeing the differences. So the idea was to stop this gap, stop this at 3rd grade, this separation going on, and waiting for this separation. As you can see, the green and blue line starts to really significantly separate between 3rd and 4th grade. Well, that's when I can measure it, but I want to avoid that. And so RTI, which then led to MTSS, is this idea that what we want to do is we want to predict, as I mentioned, using universal strategies for all individuals. We want to remediate, and we want to continue to assess and progress based on what we're remediating on to, 1, alter our instruction, and 2, potentially lead to diagnosis. Now, this is where we diverge. Not diverging in this way, but this is where we diverge between MTSS and RTI. RTI essentially was an element to do better diagnosis. And by the way, RTI also said you just can't use one test. And IDA actually said this in 2004. You just can't use one test to determine the eligibility of a child, like with a learning disability. You can't use just one process in terms of formalized assessment. You need to have data from teacher work samples and student work samples, of course. You need to have perspectives from teachers. You need to have data over time. It can't be this simple formula and now you're eligible or ineligible. That wasn't going to work. So with that, RTI starts falling, but then MTSS in a way says, well, wait a minute here, let's look at all individuals. And let's look at all individuals, and let's just not look for a disability categorization or assessment or diagnosis, but instead, let's see through this tier model if we can also include other individuals that we're going to struggle that can be successful when supported in a tier 2. They may never get to tier 3, and we're not thinking disabilities, but we're thinking regular data, we're thinking good interventions, well, we're thinking a host of things. And here we're looking at the fact that there's going to be 2 or more tiers to increase what's called intensive, scientifically research-based interventions. Now this came out of No Child Left Behind, and through the 21st century, the beginning part here, this idea of evidence-based, research-based interventions, we know they work and we're going to intervene with those. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to problem solve, and we're going to problem solve across groups and tiers, and we're going to think of different types of interventions we can offer and ways to be able to address this. Now, the progress monitoring itself is also going to be the individual, as well as across the entire class, as well as across the entire building. And we're going to do this periodically. We're not going to wait to assess 3 times a year, although assessing 3 times a year couldn't hurt. We're going to progress monitoring to make adjustments during the time of the intervention. And of course, we're going to do this across a number of different individuals. So it's a radical change from what we've done in the past. And here, let me have you watch a video here. And this video really captures it. It's several minutes long, but it really captures the elements of MTSS and shows the differences here. So here we go.
Okay, so how are you going to get from there to there?
Oh, and as you're watching it, get a sense of the problem solving, get a sense of the team approach, get a sense of the fact that people have multiple roles, get a sense of the progress monitoring, the data collected, get a sense of the evidence based interventions that are being used. It's really a holistic model for all individuals, particularly struggling learners and those with disabilities.
I think it's southwest.
Okay, try it. Like, take your finger. Now follow my finger with me. West. Did we get to our destination?
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
It's a real challenge to educators today to figure out how do you use your available resources so that every child succeeds. Before we started our work, we had what other schools had. There would be a teacher in a classroom, they would teach a curriculum, and if a student needed extra help, out the door they went, down the hallway they went, and somebody else pulled out all the tricks that they knew and tried to teach that child. So for us, it was really flipping that whole model upside down and saying, these are the resources we have available to us. How do we get everybody working together to design a system that is more seamless for students?
This system would not work without teacher collaboration.
Every decision we make, we have to make as a team.
We can problem solve together and look at data together and make decisions about what kids need.
If we're going to work collectively to ensure the success of every child, then we had to get on the same page about what we were teaching. So for us, it was an early lesson in identifying a core curriculum in math and reading that was the same no matter who the teacher was.
Now to get us started.
So every single student will receive universal instruction, core instruction, also known as Tier 1. Some kids will need supplemental instruction. They'll need a little bit more than core. So you'll hear that referred to as Tier 2. And then some kids may need more intensive intervention. And so you'll hear that referred to as Tier 3.
So what did it tell you to do? How are you going to figure it out?
Probably.
Teachers at the very beginning of the block are teaching core instruction to their core 22 students. And then they would move into a time that we call autonomous time, where the students will be more self-directed in their learning.
Colombian or the break.
So some teachers may pull Tier 2 at that time. You also may see Tier 3 being pulled at that time in a very small room where kids can really focus.
So this book is about the Constitution.
It's pretty awesome here. My three favorite things are math, writing, and reading. It's kind of cool, so you don't just with one teacher and you get to kind of move rooms and move teachers. When you go down into with Mr. Kirby and your small group, then it really stretches your brain in a really good way.
So teachers organize themselves in a variety of different ways, and it depends on teacher strengths and student needs. We may need a specific group just on predicting, and you don't have 5 kids who need predicting in your 22. You have a whole bunch of them across the learning community. So it's really important that the tiers are connected. Your core instruction could be inferring. If they're receiving Tier 1 with me and Tier 2 with you and Tier 3 with someone else, we all are really teaching inferring. We just may be teaching it with different materials. That requires a lot of trust amongst teachers, and that also requires teachers to communicate. They meet every Wednesday in a learning community, and they definitely check in with each other about instruction.
They have almost all of their packet already filled out, and then there's some groups of kids that don't have anything filled out.
We have the same problems with when they come to us, they have to finish up the packet. So if we try to stick to what that core part is,
and then we meet as a student success team. That team is made up of myself, the learning community leader, all of the core teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, speech and language pathologists.
All of those stakeholders will sit around the table together, take a look at all the data, have deep conversations about the effectiveness of the core instruction, and also monitor the progress of the Tier 2 groups and the Tier 3 and then problem solve together to figure out the ways in which they might make adjustments. And then once they make those major adjustments, then they'll come back together once a month to make sure progress is being made.
Percent of the time, and then reading, which was mini lesson, 45% of the time, and then 83% of the time. And then he also had some really other good details.
Maybe her goal sheet is almost like twice as long, so she has more space like on Monday. And right before you go into tier 2, okay, like what are the specific things you're gonna do?
I think that we're meeting the students' needs better.
The growth that we see in our students is phenomenal. We've had kids go from 8th percentile to 30th, 40th percentile, and sometimes higher.
My work is to make sure that all kids get what they need. We have lots of different types of learners, and everybody deserves to have instruction that meets their needs.
That was beautiful.
All right, so that actually gives a real broad understanding of MTSS. You can see, and clearly they indicated, it is a group problem-solving activity. It involves a variety of different data points, and of course involves different interventions. Now, the rest of this presentation is going to focus on the data element. Now, progress monitoring has been referred to as curriculum-based measurement and things of that nature, and I'm not going to worry so much about the terminology. What I want to focus in on is the fact that by doing probes, and I imagine many of you have been exposed to this already, but by doing probes, it could be in either reading, writing, mathematics, I'm going to be able to see, is the intervention that I'm providing actually having the impact I want? Now, clearly in this instance with Joshua, there's some growth going down. Let's take a look at Joshua. So we start off with weeks of instruction, and first of all, what we're trying to identify are, what's the trends? What's happening right here? And some of the trends initially are not looking particularly good. But over time, with the instructional changes, we start seeing some movement by the 17th, 19th week. And that's a lot of time. But we're seeing some movement in terms of growth. And we're making adjustments. We're making changes in our efforts rather than that waiting to fail. And in the process, we're potentially seeing some growth changes. Now, in this instance, another way of looking at it in terms of graphing, I can graph this across students, the number of students I'm working with. I can see where I'm hoping to go in terms of my overall aim line, and then where my students are actually trending, which in this instance is much higher, which is very good. It lets me understand where I am here in December as I'm shooting towards the end of the academic year. Now, another way of looking at it through different formats, and this is different programs and things of that nature, but here I can take a look and start identifying across areas. And here you can see there's certain individuals, and they're color-coded, that clearly are struggling. They're making movements, but they're certainly in that lower percentile that I want with my overall aim and trends. And so from that, I can then start identifying individuals I really need to intervene with, the supports I need to be able to provide, what's working, what's not working, both as a group of individuals, but also the individual learner. Now, with that as well, as you can see, I can also make comparisons with, like Kia here. She's making movement, and she's definitely having some response to that targeted intervention. But look where that class average is. Now, maybe she'll be moving towards that, and that's potentially a very strong indicator. But clear as you can see, the gap there between weeks 3, 4, 5, 6. There's some challenges there, but as she starts making the movement up. So these are all elements of showing the growth of an individual with the aim line, the trend lines, and what's happening. And this is a good example here where we're taking a look at what I thought, or what we all thought potentially was, oh, she's making some movement, she's making some growth, but that trend line, as you can see, is fairly slightly going up, while the aim line, and our class average is above that aim line, is significantly different. And so here, what do we do? So it's definitely an unsuccessful intervention, and we're well into the period of interventions, and clearly Kira is not going to have the success that we would expect that she would have, that she needs to have to be successful, and the data is indicating we need to intervene. It didn't have an impact. We need to intervene more significantly and more directly. So in this instance here, we have another component in terms of, wait a minute here, we're taking a look at this isn't being successful. We need to try another intervention. We need to make other changes. Now that intervention, by the way, may be out of the classroom. It may be much more intense, much more frequent, much more structured than what we've tried in the past. That's one of the reasons maybe she didn't respond. And clearly she's responding just a bit based on that second intervention. Now, here we can see in terms of we are offering some additional targeted interventions. We're going to do these targeted interventions very periodically, and we're going to do so to try to increase that trend, as you can see, slightly moving up with Kia over a number of weeks. And finally, if we are going to actually notice some success, is the fact that in this instance, okay, so we're trying some things, we have lack of success, we try a new intervention, we start collecting data. Look at that, all of a sudden, unlike the previous slide, she's starting to move, she's starting to have success, she's starting to show that her trend line now is parallel to the aim line and actually narrowing down as we get into looking forward based on her growth as an individual. Now that's a very basic way, a very common overview. If you're familiar with progress monitoring, you're saying, Sean, I could go much deeper, and sure, we can, but that will go into additional classes. My intent here was to show the fact that unlike previous efforts where we wait to fail, where we say, okay, that standardized assessment has a formula and we're waiting for you to show that differences between ability and achievement that indicates that you actually have a learning disability. What MTSS did, and MTSS did this several years ago, was saying we're going to look at all learners, we're going to have a multi-tiered systems of intervention and support. In so doing, what we're going to do is we're going to have data to determine where the child needs support, where the child needs remediation. We're going to do it across students, so of course it could be groups of students. And of course, we're going to do it across teachers, interventions, supports, etc. If we need to identify the disability in the process, fine, we have the data. We've been incrementally moving towards that, and it's clearly something else is operating within the child that we need to be able to address. If it's not due to a disability, we've made modifications, interventions, and changes based on the data, and hopefully the student will be having success. We're going to get into this deeper with tiers 1 and 2, but for the moment, that's our overview. If you have questions, you know how to reach me. Email, call, text. I hope this was a bit of a review for some. I hope this was a thorough enough introduction for others. Have a great rest of the day.